There's a moment that Carl Jung witnessed repeatedly in his clinical practice, a moment so quiet it goes unnoticed by most people, yet so powerful, it marks the end of an entire era in an empath's life. It's not the day you cry. It's not the day you scream or confront. It's the day you simply stop feeling. Not because you were broken, but because something inside you, an ancient part that always believed love could save anyone, finally gives up. And in that surrender, something extraordinary happens. You go cold. Not in the cruel, manipulative way the narcissist does, but in what Jung called sacred indifference, the kind of coldness that doesn't come from hatred, but from the deepest and most complete emotional disconnection. You look at the person who once occupied every corner of your mind and you feel nothing. Not love, not anger, not hope. Just a quiet emptiness, almost serene, like the surface of a frozen lake beneath which all life has stopped moving. Jung discovered something disturbing about this moment. It doesn't happen when you want it to. It cannot be forced or manufactured. It arrives on its own, like winter comes after autumn, inevitable and complete. And when it arrives, those around you become frightened. Because the empath everyone knew, the one who always gave another chance, who always understood, who always waited, simply disappeared. In their place stands someone Jung described as psychologically untouchable, someone who can be in the same room with you, look into your eyes, hear your words, and remain completely, absolutely, disconnected. The narcissist feels this immediately, not consciously, but at some deep, primal level, they sense the change, because their source has run dry. The energy that fed them, that made their mask seem real, that gave fuel to their inflated ego simply dried up. And when the narcissist tries their old tactics, when they try to pull you back with false love, guilt, anger, or seduction, something terrifying happens. Nothing. You don't react. You don't defend yourself. You don't explain. You simply exist in a space where they can no longer reach you. As if a wall of ice had risen between you both, transparent enough that they can see you, but solid enough that they can never touch you again. Jung called this the death of the empathic ego, the moment when the identity you built around being understanding, forgiving, infinitely patient, dies. Not gradually, but all at once, like a candle being extinguished. And in that darkness, in that absolute silence, something new begins to be born. Something the narcissist never expected to encounter. An empath who finally learned the greatest lesson of all, that some people don't deserve your warmth, that some souls must be left in the cold they themselves created. And that feeling, everything doesn't mean you need to carry everything. If you've ever felt this moment, this turning point where something inside you simply shut off and never came back, I need you to know one thing. You didn't become the monster. You became free. And what comes next is not your destruction. It's theirs. Jung spent years studying what he called the alchemical transformations of the psyche, and among them all, none was more fascinating or more devastating than what happens when an empath finally goes cold. In ancient alchemy, there is a stage known as albedo, the whitening, where all matter is purified through freezing. And this, Jung realized, was exactly what happened to empaths after prolonged abuse. They entered a psychological winter so deep that everything false, everything performative, everything based on illusory hope, simply froze and shattered. This coldness is not emotional frigidity in the common sense. Jung carefully distinguished between what he called narcissistic coldness, which is the inability to feel, and integrated empathic coldness, which is the conscious refusal to invest emotion where it won't be honored. The narcissist is cold because their core is empty. The empath becomes cold because their core finally refuses to be wasted. It's the difference between a desert, which never had water, and a frozen ocean, which contains entire oceans of depth locked beneath an impenetrable surface. When you reach this state, Jung observed, your presence changes completely. You no longer need to explain your boundaries because they've become part of your energetic structure. You no longer need to defend yourself because attacks simply slide off your surface without penetrating. You no longer need to prove your worth because your coldness comes from absolute certainty that people who cannot see your value don't deserve your warmth. This terrifies the narcissist in ways they cannot articulate, because their entire dynamic is based on provoking reaction, on making you feel, on keeping you emotionally engaged, even if through pain. But when you go cold, when you really, truly shut down, there's nothing for them to manipulate. It's like trying to set ice on fire. No matter how much flame they bring, you don't burn. You melt eventually, but not for them. You melt only when you choose, only when you find warmth worthy of your vulnerability. Jung documented cases where narcissists became obsessed with empaths who had reached this state of coldness. They returned repeatedly, not because they felt love, but because they couldn't bear being irrelevant. The empath's coldness was a mirror that reflected their own insignificance, and that was unbearable for an ego that needed to feel important, even through hatred. Jung wrote in his notes about a patient referred to only as S, who had reached this state after years of psychological abuse. She became so cold toward her abuser that he began having nervous breakdowns, begging for any reaction, any sign that he still mattered. But S remained unmoved, observing his attempts with what Jung described as distant compassion, the kind of compassion you might feel for a wild animal trapped in its own nature, but without ever opening the cage. And perhaps now you're beginning to realize that your coldness isn't cruelty. It's protection. It's wisdom. It's the natural response of a soul that finally learned that not everyone deserves access to your warmest places. If you feel you need a map to navigate this transformation, to understand what's happening inside you, I've prepared something that might help you. It's in the first pinned comment. There's a reason the narcissist panics when you go cold, and it has everything to do with what Jung called the mirror function in the narcissist-empath dynamic. All the time you were warm, emotional, reactive. You were serving as the mirror that made the narcissist feel real. Every tear you cried was confirmation of their power. Every moment of hope was validation of the illusion they created. Every time you tried to understand them, explain them, save them, you were polishing the mirror that reflected their grandiosity back to themselves. But Jung discovered something devastating about what happens when that mirror freezes. A frozen mirror doesn't reflect. It only shows what's directly in front of it, without distortion, without warmth, without the softness the empath always offered. And what the narcissist sees when they look at the cold empath isn't their own greatness. It's their emptiness, their smallness, their complete and total irrelevance in the life of someone who once revolved around them. This isn't just painful for the narcissist. It's existentially terrifying, because for the first time, perhaps in their entire life, they're being confronted with the truth they've spent years avoiding, that without other people's energy, they are nothing. Jung observed that narcissists often experience what he called the collapse of the false self when confronted with empathic coldness. They begin to disintegrate, not dramatically, but silently, internally. Their confidence wavers, their mask slips, their manipulations become desperate and obvious, because the empath's coldness removes the fuel that kept the entire performance running. It's like watching an actor on stage realize the audience has left. They can keep performing, but the meaning is gone. And here's what Jung found most fascinating. The cold empath doesn't need to do anything active to destroy the narcissist. The destruction happens automatically, as a natural consequence of removing the mirror. The narcissist destroys themselves trying to recover the reflection, trying to provoke reaction, trying to prove they still matter. But each attempt meets only ice, and each failure deepens their downward spiral. Jung wrote about a case where a narcissist, after months of trying to provoke any emotional response from an empath who had gone cold, had a complete breakdown. He admitted to Jung that he felt like he was disappearing, as if his very existence depended on that person's reaction. And without it, he didn't know who he was. This reveals the deepest truth Jung discovered about this dynamic. The narcissist was always the dependent one, always the weak one, always the one who needed the other to exist. The empath, despite all their sensitivity, was always the strong one. And when the empath finally goes cold, this truth becomes impossible to deny. The person who seemed powerful was actually a parasite, and the person who seemed weak was actually the source of all life in the relationship. When you go cold, you're not lowering yourself to their level. You're finally rising to your own level, to the level where you don't need external validation to know who you are, where you don't need emotional reciprocity to justify your worth, where you can simply exist, complete, whole, untouchable, while they fall apart trying to reach something that no longer exists for them. Jung identified that there's a specific moment that precedes the empath's total coldness, a moment he called the death of sacred hope. This isn't ordinary despair. It's not the sadness of a broken heart. It's something much deeper and more final. It's the moment when you stop believing that person can change. Stop believing that if you just love more, understand more, wait more, they'll finally see you. It's the death of the fantasy that kept you trapped for so long. Jung observed that empaths carry what he called the Redeemer archetype, the deeply rooted belief that their love can save anyone, can heal any wound, can transform any darkness into light. And narcissists unconsciously exploit exactly this. They present themselves as projects, as wounded souls waiting to be saved, as rough diamonds waiting to be polished by the empath's love. And the empath, faithful to their archetype, dives into the rescue mission with their whole heart. But Jung discovered that this hope, as beautiful as it seems, is actually the empath's very prison. Because as long as there's hope, there's emotional connection. As long as there's belief in change, there's energy investment. As long as there's the fantasy that one day they'll wake up and finally love you the way you deserve, you remain chained. The death of this hope is brutal. Jung compared it to amputation without anesthesia. You feel every nerve being cut, every connection being severed, every possibility being destroyed. But it's also, paradoxically, the most liberating moment in the empath's journey. Because when hope dies, emotional obligation dies with it. You no longer need to try, no longer need to prove, no longer need to wait. You can simply stop. And in that stopping, in that cessation of all effort, coldness finally settles in, not as a choice, but as a natural response. Like the body entering hypothermia to preserve vital organs, your psyche enters emotional coldness to preserve what remains of yourself. Jung documented that empaths often describe this moment as feeling something die inside them. They say things like, "It's as if a part of me shut down and never came back," or "I feel like something essential in me froze permanently." And Jung would confirm, yes, something died. But it wasn't your capacity to love. It was your willingness to waste love on those who cannot receive it. What dies isn't your heart. It's your naivety, your credulity, your belief that everyone deserves infinite chances. And the narcissist feels this death as if it were their own. They feel the exact moment you stop hoping they'll change. And it terrifies them. Because as long as you had hope, they had power. Your hope was the rope that kept them connected to you. But when that rope breaks, when that hope finally dies, they're set adrift, alone, irrelevant, and all the manipulation in the world cannot bring back something that died completely. If you recognize this moment in your own journey, if you can identify the day when hope finally died and coldness began, I want you to know that you didn't lose your humanity. You reclaimed your dignity. That death was necessary. It was sacred. It was the price of your freedom. Among all the weapons Jung studied in the psychological war between narcissists and empaths, none was more devastating than what he called the conscious silence of the awakened empath. It's not the narcissist's silent treatment, which is a form of punishment and control. It's something completely different. It's the silence of someone who simply has nothing left to say. Not because they're angry, not because they're trying to manipulate, but because they've arrived at a place of complete emotional disconnection, where words have become unnecessary. Jung observed that the narcissist is addicted to reaction. They need to provoke response, any response, because response means relevance. They'd rather be hated than ignored. They'd rather make you cry than make you feel nothing, because as long as you're feeling something about them, they exist in your reality. But when you go cold and silent, when you stop explaining, defending, justifying, reacting, something terrifying happens for the narcissist. They begin to disappear, not literally, but psychologically. They lose definition of who they are because they've always defined themselves through your reaction to them. Jung documented cases where narcissists tried increasingly desperately to break the empath's silence. They sent messages, called, showed up unexpectedly, created dramas, made accusations, even declarations of love, anything to provoke response. But when the empath remained cold and silent, the narcissists began to visibly disintegrate. Jung described it as watching someone fighting against a void. Each manipulation attempt met only silence. Each emotional attack was absorbed by nothingness. Each dramatic performance happened for an audience of one who had left the theater. The power of this silence, Jung explained, comes from the fact that it's not reactive. It's receptive. The empath isn't silent because they're planning revenge or holding a grudge. They're silent because they genuinely have no more emotional investment in the dynamic. It's the silence of someone who has moved to a completely different frequency, where the narcissist simply no longer exists as a priority, as a concern, as anything significant. And this kind of irrelevance is the death of the narcissistic ego. Jung noticed something particularly fascinating about how other people react when they witness a cold, silent empath. Family members and friends often become uncomfortable, asking the empath to be the bigger person, to forgive and forget, to stop holding a grudge. But Jung recognized that these reactions revealed more about their discomfort with healthy boundaries than about the empath's behavior. Society, he observed, is conditioned to pressure empaths back into the role of infinite forgivers because their coldness forces everyone around them to confront their own failures in establishing boundaries. The cold empath's silence isn't cruelty. It's clarity. It's the external manifestation of an internal truth that some people don't deserve space in your emotional life, that some dynamics don't deserve your time or energy, that some relationships need to die completely without ceremony, without explanation, without performative closure. Just silence. Final. Absolute. Liberating. Jung wrote that conscious silence is the highest form of communication because it communicates the one thing words never could, that you've moved beyond the need to be understood by those who never had the capacity to understand you, that you've fully accepted that some people never deserve the sound of your voice. Jung discovered something extraordinary about what happens during the period of empathic coldness. Far from being a sterile or empty state, it's actually one of the most creatively fertile periods in the empath's life. He called this gestation in psychological winter, where beneath the frozen surface, a profound transformation is occurring. Like seeds that need winter's cold to germinate in spring, the empath needs this period of coldness for a new self to emerge. During this time, Jung observed, the empath goes through what he called identity reconfiguration. Their entire life, they defined themselves through their capacity to feel, to give, to understand, to forgive. But now, in the cold, they're forced to discover who they are when they're not performing empathy for anyone, when they're not saving anyone, when they're not being the source of emotional light for others. And this discovery, though frightening, is profoundly liberating. Jung noted that empaths at this stage often rediscover parts of themselves that had been suppressed for years. Abandoned hobbies resurface. Old dreams are reconsidered. Healthy relationships that had been neglected are revitalized. It's as if, by freezing the part of them that always gave, they finally have energy to invest in themselves. And this energy, when directed internally, creates what Jung called alchemical self-nourishment, the capacity to give themselves what they always gave to others. But Jung warned that this period also comes with what he called temptations of premature thawing. The narcissist, sensing the transformation happening, often makes one last grandiose attempt to pull the empath back. They may appear to have changed. They may make elaborate promises. They may even seek therapy as performance. And the empath, feeling a moment of warmth returning, may be tempted to believe. Jung warned vehemently against this. The freezing, he insisted, must complete its natural cycle. Premature thawing results in more severe refreezing later. The empath must remain in winter until spring arrives naturally, not forcefully. During this period of reconstruction in the cold, Jung recommended what he called sovereign empathy practices. First, energy inventory. consciously tracking where your emotional energy goes and reclaiming it from places that don't honor your value. Second, dialogue with the frozen self. Instead of fearing or rejecting your coldness, conversing with it, understanding what it's protecting, what it's creating. Third, cultivation of selectivity, consciously practicing choosing who and what deserves your warmth when it returns. Jung observed that empaths who honored this cold period, who didn't try to artificially thaw or force premature warmth, emerged with what he called sovereign empathy. They maintained their capacity to feel deeply but developed radical discernment about with whom to share that depth. They could be deeply compassionate without being exploitable. They could offer generous love without losing themselves. They had learned the art of being warm with those who deserved their warmth, while remaining perfectly cold with those who proved they would abuse it. And if right now you feel you're in this psychological winter, in this period of reconstruction in the cold, know that you're not lost. You're being remodeled. And when you emerge, you won't be the same empath who entered. You'll be something far more powerful. If you need guidance through this process, a map to navigate this transformation, I've prepared a guide that can accompany you. It's in the first pinned comment, waiting for you. While the empath is being reconstructed in the cold, Jung meticulously documented what happened simultaneously with the narcissist, and what he discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. The narcissist, deprived of the empath's emotional fuel, enters what Jung called a spiral of psychological decompensation. It's not dramatic, it's not obvious to casual observers, but for those who know what to look for, it's unmistakable. First comes what Jung called supply starvation. The narcissist desperately needs to replace the energy the empath provided. They move quickly to new sources, new relationships, new victims. But Jung observed something crucial. No one can replace an evolved empath. Others may provide superficial admiration, but not the depth of mirroring the empath offered. The narcissist begins to feel a hunger they cannot name, a dissatisfaction that no new conquest can fill. Because what they lost wasn't just attention. It was the only person who truly saw them and still chose to stay. And that's irreplaceable. Next, Jung identified what he called narrative collapse. Narcissists build elaborate stories about themselves, stories where they're always the victim or the hero, never the villain. But the empath's absolute coldness breaks these narratives. Because how do you portray yourself as a victim when the person simply left and built a better life without you? How do you present yourself as irresistible when someone is completely indifferent to your existence? The narrative crumbles, and with it, the identity the narcissist constructed. Jung then observed what he called restoration attempts through provocation. The narcissist tries to regain relevance through increasingly dramatic behavior. They may spread gossip, make public accusations, even create crises to force the empath to break silence. But each attempt that meets only coldness adds another layer of humiliation to the narcissist's ego. They're performing for an audience that isn't watching. And that irrelevance is more devastating than any direct confrontation could be. Eventually, Jung documented, comes what he called mask deterioration. The narcissist can no longer maintain the facade of charm and confidence. Friends begin noticing inconsistencies. New partners see through manipulations more quickly. The carefully constructed reputation begins to crack. Because maintaining the narcissistic mask requires constant energy, and without the empath to provide validation and mirroring, they simply don't have enough fuel to sustain the performance. Jung noted that in rare, very rare cases, the narcissist might have a moment of what he called accidental self-confrontation. A moment of brutal clarity where they see, just for a second, the devastation they caused and the vacuity of their own existence. But Jung observed that most narcissists cannot bear this glimpse. They immediately build new defenses, find new ways to avoid truth, dive deeper into denial. Because accepting truth would require a humility their ego simply cannot allow. What becomes clear in Jung's studies is that the empath, by going cold, isn't destroying the narcissist through action, but through absence. The destruction doesn't come from what the empath does, but from what they stop doing. Stop providing mirroring. Stop offering validation. Stop being the audience for the performance. And without these things, The narcissist crumbles under the weight of their own vacuity. They become the architect of their own ruin, simply because the only person keeping them standing withdrew their support. And they discovered that alone, they cannot stand. Jung spent the final years of his life fascinated by what he called the final phase of empathic evolution, the moment when the ice begins to melt, not because someone forced it, but because winter fulfilled its purpose. And what emerges, Jung observed, isn't the same empath who entered the cold. It's something he called the sovereign empath, someone who maintained their depth while developing unbreakable boundaries, someone who can feel everything while remaining centered in themselves, someone who learned the sacred art of loving without losing themselves. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, carries a quality others feel immediately. There's a presence about them, a solidity, a peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. They can enter a room and people feel both their warmth and their inaccessibility. They're simultaneously the most compassionate and the least exploitable. They can hold space for someone's pain without taking responsibility for fixing it. They can love deeply without needing to be reciprocated. They can give generously without exhausting themselves. Because they learned the secret Jung spent his life teaching, that true empathy isn't dissolving into the other, but remaining whole while witnessing the other's experience. Jung identified that these sovereign empaths often become what he called conscious guardians of their own warmth. They're not cold with everyone. They've simply become radically selective about with whom they share their depth. They can be perfectly polite, even friendly with most people, but reserve their deepest layers only for those who've proven they can honor the gift. And the narcissist, with their inability for genuine reciprocity, will never again have access to those layers. Not because the empath hates them, but because the empath finally understood that some people simply don't have capacity for real depth. Most beautifully, Jung observed, these sovereign empaths often attract completely different relationships from what they used to attract, because their energy has fundamentally changed. They're no longer emanating what Jung called rescue light, the energy that attracts broken people looking to be fixed. Instead, they emanate what he called sovereignty light, an energy that attracts only those who've already done their own internal work, who arrive not to take, but to share, not to be saved, but to co-create something beautiful. Jung concluded that the day the empath goes cold isn't the end of the story, it's the turning point. It's the moment when years, sometimes decades of giving themselves away were finally interrupted. And in that interruption, in that forced silence, in that psychological winter, the empath finally had the chance to know themselves outside the role of savior, to discover that they're not valuable because of what they give, but because of who they are, that their depth doesn't need to be proven, that their love doesn't need to be earned through endless sacrifice. If you've made it this far, if you recognized your own journey through these words, I want you to know something Jung believed deeply. Your coldness wasn't failure, it was evolution. It wasn't you becoming less human, it was you becoming more whole. The ice you felt form around your heart wasn't protecting you from loving again, it was protecting you from wasting love again, and that's a sacred distinction. Jung wrote in his final journals about the sovereign empath. They are rare, these who survived the fire of narcissistic abuse and emerged not bitter, but wise, not closed but selective, not broken, but rebuilt with gold in the cracks, like the Japanese art of kintsugi. They carry their scars not as shame but as evidence of battles they fought and won. And the victory wasn't over the narcissist. It was over the part of themselves that believed they needed to sacrifice themselves to be loved. The deepest truth Jung discovered is this: the day you went cold was the day you began warming yourself. You stopped giving your fire to those who used it to burn you and started using that fire to illuminate your own path. And that path, though sometimes lonely, leads to a place where you finally understand that the person you were looking for all along, the person who could see you, value you, love you completely, was always you. If this journey resonated with you, if you see reflections of your own transformation in these words, I would be deeply honored if you shared in the comments where you are in this journey. Are you still in the cold? Are you beginning to feel the thaw? Or have you already emerged as a sovereign empath? Your story matters. Your voice matters. And someone reading this right now, Someone who's still frozen and afraid they'll never feel warmth again needs to hear that on the other side exists not just survival, but something extraordinary. If you found value in this exploration of Jungian psychology, if these words helped you understand what's happening inside you, please consider subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to discover about the depths of human transformation, about how pain can be portal, about how what seems like ending can be the most powerful beginning you've ever had. And if you know someone who's in this psychological winter now, someone who went cold and is afraid it means they lost their humanity, please share this video with them. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is remind someone that their coldness isn't character failure. It's sacred boundary. It's self-healing in action. It's the soul saying no more with such conviction that the entire universe stops to listen. And if you feel you're ready to go deeper, to truly transform this experience of coldness into integrated wisdom, to understand not just what happened but who you're becoming because of it, I've created something especially for you. It's a guide I call Your Pain Was Not in Vain, a Jungian guide to transforming the pain of impossible love into self-knowledge and inner strength. This guide will accompany you through 30 days of the process Jung identified as empathic individuation. You'll understand why you went cold, what this coldness is protecting, and how to transform it not into permanent bitterness, but into sacred discernment. You'll learn to recognize the difference between closing your heart and protecting it wisely. You'll discover how to feel warmth again, but this time, directing it only where it will be honored. It's in the first pinned comment, waiting for you when you're ready. Not as a quick fix, but as a journey companion. As a map through the territory Jung spent decades charting. As a daily reminder that your transformation isn't happening to you, but through you. And that there's deep purpose in every moment of cold you endured. Thank you for trusting me with 30 minutes of your precious time. Thank you for having the courage to look at your own coldness without judgment, to recognize that sometimes the greatest act of self-love is the absolute refusal to keep loving those who cannot love you back. Thank you for doing the work that most people spend their lives avoiding, the work of becoming whole, even when it means going through a winter that seems endless. You're not lost in the cold. You're being forged in it. And what emerges when spring finally comes, when you choose to melt only for those worthy of your warmth, is what Jung called a psychological miracle. An empath who kept their depth but gained sovereignty. Someone who can feel everything but isn't controlled by feeling. Someone who chose themselves and in that choice became worthy of being chosen by others who also chose themselves. May you walk with grace through your winter. May you trust that the ice has purpose. May you know in the deepest place of your soul that your coldness isn't the end of your capacity to love. It's the beginning of your capacity to love wisely. And that's the highest form of love there is. Blessings on your journey. You are not alone. You never were. And your cold, however frightening it seems, is the womb where your most powerful self is being gestated. Until we meet again in the next exploration of the depths of the human soul.